In 1886, the engineer Carl Benz predicted that the worldwide demand for automobiles would never surpass 1 million. 8 years later, in 1894, an article appeared in the Times newspaper predicting that within 50 years, every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. How could they have got things so wrong? Simple. Both predictions were based on past experience. They were extrapolations built upon what turned out to be short-term trends. Put another way, they both use critically false assumptions. In the case of Carl Benz, the mistake was to assume that cars would always require a chauffeur and that eventually the supply of skilled chauffeurs would just dry up. In the case of London being buried under horse manure, the mistake was to assume that the growth in horse transport would rise indefinitely alongside the population of London. The article also totally misjudged, or possibly ignored, the disruptive impact of the motor car invented by Mr. Benz. On the other hand, the accuracy of some predictions can actually be quite good, especially if you give them enough time to come true. History, it would seem, is a necessary accompaniment to futurology. For example, H.G. Wells wrote about the launching of ballistic missiles from submarines in his book The Shape of Things to Come in 1933. While Arthur C. Clarke foresaw a network of communications satellites in geostationary orbit around the Earth way back in 1945. Admittedly, some of these are broad concepts rather than specific predictions. But this doesn't negate the fact that a few seers do occasionally get it right, and the future would actually be quite a good subject for serious study if only some of the sources were a bit more forthcoming. So how should we engage with the future? First of all, I think it's absolutely essential that we have a view about the future, especially if you are a leader. After all, how can you lead people if you can't communicate to them where they're going? I think it's absolutely essential that leaders have a clear view about what the environment external to their organization will look like in 5, 10, even 15 years' time, and have a clear idea of how they will deal with the risks and opportunities that will inevitably emerge from changing situations. Using trends is one way of achieving this. Trends are quite useful in terms of determining short-term direction. They're also quite useful in relatively stable environments. But, as we've already seen, trends can get you into a whole heap of trouble unless you keep an open mind and keep your eyes and ears open for changing conditions. One reason that trends can be tricky is that trends represent the historical unfolding of events or dispositions. They tell us next to nothing about future direction over the longer term or the velocity of ideas or events. They do not take into account the impact of counter-trends or new innovations either. Another option is to travel to places or speak to people that have, in a sense, already experienced parts of the future. The writer William Gibson famously said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Put another way, the secret to the future lies buried in the fringes of the present. You can uncover many of these secrets by talking to younger people, passionate enthusiasts, heavy users of products, or going to specific places that are already ahead in terms of the adoption of new thinking. But there's a really big problem here too, which is that in my view, there's no such thing as the future. The future is uncertain. At best, it's ambiguous. There must surely be more than one alternative, more than one way that the future could unfold. One way of dealing with this ambiguity is through the use of scenarios. The point of scenarios is to help people anticipate change by going beyond simple linear extrapolations. Scenarios are not a way of getting the future 100% right. That's impossible. They're a useful way of avoiding getting it 100% wrong, a way of avoiding nasty shocks. Interestingly, in my experience, scenarios are useful, more often than not, because they give people an excuse. And the excuse is to stop what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and to think really deeply about where they're going. For example, you could use scenarios to examine whether digital connectivity is a short-term chimera or a sustainable long-term development. You could use scenarios to explore opportunities around remote monitoring, or you could use scenarios to explore some of the risks associated with electronic record keeping or genetic profiling. But even here, there is a problem. The ability to foresee a range of alternative outcomes is a very useful skill. But a better mindset, in my view, is commitment. What I mean by this is that leaders, ideally linking together, should pick a future and start building it. For example, we might decide that remote monitoring allows older people to stay in their own homes for much longer, thereby freeing up hospital beds and also places at care homes. Or we might decide the absolute opposite. that all remote monitoring is doing is enforcing isolation and loneliness. Deciding on which future we want won't be easy. Chances are we'll get a lot of things wrong. But if we could at least agree where we're going, I think we'd feel more comfortable with the present. And the future would be a better place to live. To end, I'd like to leave you with a quote that partly explains what I'm trying to do. The British sculptor Henry Moore once said, "The secret to life is to have a task, something you bring everything to, every minute of the day, for the whole of the rest of your life. And the most important thing is, it must be something you cannot possibly do." What this means for me is that trying to predict the future is impossible. But by trying to do it, I sometimes gain a better understanding of what is going on right now and what choices we can make. Thinking about the future often enough means that we sometimes end up changing it. Thank you.